When people ask you why you're successful or why things seem to be easier for you or why you're not fearful in a time of fear, you don't tell them all the things you did to get there. You tell them it's God. A lot of Bible characters had mixed traits. A lot of famous Bible characters had really good traits, but they also had some really serious lack of character in other ways that they had to overcome. And sometimes I guess it's easier to relate for most of us to people that had both, because most of us are that way. And I'm sure Daniel had some traits that you wouldn't want to emulate. But pretty much the book of Daniel, as he's presented, is someone that unlike most people that we know, even in the church, he seemed to be a guy that was just super strong in his principles and his purity and his purpose and his prayer life. And so those are the four things as we go through here that we're going to talk about. He obtained preeminence and power in his lifetime. And for those who know, at least so far just in this class, if you didn't already know, he's not someone that started in a position having been taken by the king of another country and taken to a country as a slave, basically, as a person that was basically uprooted and taken to a new place, and he was, it didn't look like things were going to be good for him at the beginning as a young man. But he rose to that, and we're going to talk a little bit of how he got there. Daniel 1:3-6 talks about the fact that how he was basically a captive in a country, and how the king ordered the chief of courts to find some very bright people of good upbringing from Israel who they had brought over as slaves, and training them to serve the king. And so Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as we know them better, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were four of the people, slaves from Israel, who were trained to serve the king. And we find in a little bit later in the same chapter that the king talked to them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of the whole kingdom. So these kids, basically, if you remember when Monty did his lesson, he brought Harrison up here, and here's Harrison, and we look at him and say, well, he's a young man. He's got a lot to learn, and that's true. They did, and people that age. But you know what? These three or four total, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were incredibly ahead of their time, apparently, in their intelligence and their wisdom. And I think we all probably have a good guess of why they were so ahead of that. But we're going to talk about, maybe what traits we need to have to gain that. Because, it's in our culture, it tends to be a time when people spread their wild oats. It tends to be a time when people stray away from where they should be before hopefully they come back to where they were grounded in. These four, maybe it's partially because of the situation they were in, but I think, a lot of times when you're in the situation they're in, you would say, why should I do this? Look what happened. Look where I ended up. So he was ultimately given power over all of Babylon, and he also received similar power in the Medo-Persian Empire once they overthrew the Babylonian Empire. So the questions we're going to ponder a little bit this morning are basically, how was Daniel able to reach a position of power and influence in a non-godly country without compromising his position as a godly man? That's probably something we could all learn from today, right? How can we reach a godly position in a country which is what they say post-God? A country that if you read the statistics in the newspapers and on the TV and in a lot of places now, within the last 10 to 15 years, we've gone from people professing to be Christian or to believe in God at a high level, even though they weren't practicing it, to now well over 50% of this country doesn't even believe in God. And I think Bill Hemphill has told us multiple times, probably 10-year-old material here in this county. Over 80% of the people in this county don't have a religious affiliation and don't really practice Christianity, even if they proclaim to be that, I'm Christian because I grew up Christian. In a similar fashion to I have several Jewish friends that are Jewish, but you know what? They don't go to synagogue. They don't practice their Judaism, except, in their case, it's like us with a lot of the people we know that profess to be Christians, and they go to church on Easter and Christmas. Well, the Jewish people I know, will have Hanukkah and Yom Kippur, but then they go right back to living their lives, and they're culturally Jewish, but they're not religiously owing to God. So a close look at the book of Daniel reveals his secret it shows how he was immensely successful without selling his soul, without selling out. So what are the 4 things, and did we get the handout out? All right, so everybody, anybody that doesn't have a handout, put your hand up. Stacy will get you a handout. Teresa Briggs needs one. And so if you happen to be one that's like my wife that is big on filling in the blanks and you miss a blank, we'll go back and get that for you. So Daniel purposed in his heart. The first thing that Daniel, of the 4 traits we're going to learn, is purpose. Daniel appeared to have a purpose. And we all should have a purpose in our lives, because if you don't have a purpose, you're going to just be on a sea tossed to and fro, reacting to everything that happens to you, instead of having a plan to go where you should be going, and then you can react to what happens to you, but you already have a purpose and a plan of where you're going. You're not going to be washed here and washed there. So as a young boy in a strange land, Daniel was immediately faced with a challenge to violate God's law regarding eating. They wanted to give him wine. They wanted to give him, probably pork. They wanted to give him, who wouldn't want Shaq, living and growing up in the South, barbecue, right? How could you moved him to Mississippi or Alabama or something like that, and he wouldn't eat barbecue and drink sweet tea. There'd be something really wrong with him, right? I just spent a couple of weeks in the Deep South, and I went up, and they had tea and unsweet tea. They didn't have sweet tea and unsweet tea. That's where it is down here, and that's where it is most of the country. But they had tea, and they had unsweet tea for you that aren't from around here. And I knew from growing up there that tea meant sweet tea. So here he is challenged, and what do there's sort of a worldly kind of idea when in Rome you do as the Romans do, right? So, what's it going to hurt for me to drink a little bit of the king's wine and eat a little bit of his barbecue, and that kind of stuff, and eat some whatever he's given me, because, if you're trying to impress the people and socially climb and business climb and get out of being a slave from Israel and become a prominent guy, first thing most people do is say, I got to start figuring out how to act, and I got to start figuring out how I'm going to do what I'm going to do. But despite his youth and his obvious pressures to conform, Daniel purposed in his heart, we're told in Daniel 1:8, to uphold the law of God no matter the cost. So this is one of his first challenges as, a guy that's probably a teenager who's being challenged. And, peer pressure is an amazing thing, but it's even more so when you take a teenager and put him among a bunch of royals, a bunch of, super important people, and then you're telling him, you don't have to do much. You just, we're going to feed you stuff that everybody else wants. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile. That's another thing. Today we're taught, in the world, that if you don't like what's going on, what do? You protest. I'm going to protest. You can't make me eat that. Well, back then you probably wouldn't have said you can't make me eat that, because then that would, back then it wasn't quite like it is today. But still, and yet, he could have just tried not eating it. Why didn't you eat your meat there? Well, I'm full. I had all I could eat. I'm full. But no, he actually proactively, because of his purpose, went and talked to the guy who was bringing him the food and said, let's work out a deal here. Let's work out let's figure out how I don't compromise my principles, veer from my purpose, and yet still survive, if not thrive, in this new country where he's learning a new language and he's learning all the things he needs to learn so he can be refined and be respected. Well, because of his willingness to put God first, God granted Daniel favor in the sight of others. In 1:9 it says, "Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion." So that's interesting that God was affecting what was going on here. So it's not just that Daniel was so persuasive. We probably all knew people. I could name off a couple of names. I'm not going to do so. But we know people who are so magnetic in their personality that they can, basically work a room and get people to do almost anything. I've been told, whether you like him or not, that President Bill Clinton, I knew some people that met him in person, and they said, I couldn't stand the guy, and I met him, and he's the most likable guy I've ever met. I couldn't help but like him because of that magnetic personality he had. And likewise, one could have argued here, well, Daniel just had a magnetic personality, and, everything he did, he had a Midas touch, and everything turned to gold because he's such a persuasive, magnetic guy. But it clearly says here that God is the one who affected this official and had compassion on what he asked for. So, sometimes it just involves us saying, did you try? Did you even try before you decided? My son told my daughters one time that they said, why do you get it seemingly more than we get? And he goes, because I'm willing to ask. He said, if I ask 10 times and get 2 things I wouldn't have gotten otherwise and get told no 8 times, I still got 2 more than you did. And they go, well, I know they're going to tell me no. And he goes, I don't know they're going to tell me no till they tell me no. So I'm going to ask. And, sometimes God is just asking you to ask. Just ask your boss if you can have, when you've been somewhere for a while, you tell the same stories over and over. Maybe that's just being old. But some of you may have heard this and some of you may not have heard this, but my daughter was on a highly competitive basketball team in high school, and she was the captain of her team, and they were going to state year after year, and they practiced every night of the week. And she went to her coach and said, I want to go to church on Wednesday night. Can we practice at a different time? He knows, nobody's ever asked me that before, but I like to go to church too. So we're going to stop at 15 till 7. And this is Naples, and, God bless them right now. We're praying for them, but nothing's too far away. So, school and churches were, 15 minutes away. So it's not like Tampa where if you were trying to get here from, somewhere 10 miles away, it'd take you 30 minutes. You could run over there. And so for the next 4 years, during her time there, she was a youngster at the time, he said, we're done at 6:45 and we're all going to church. And all he had to do was ask. All he had to do was ask. So, how God did this is not explained, but we know that if you go to Genesis 39, 1 and 4, and 21 through 23, and I think I actually have it up there. We're not going to necessarily read it right now. But in a similar fashion, Joseph, he's another guy that's very, very similar in his story to Daniel. Because, Joseph was he started off being the Jacob's favorite. He was the real deal kid to his father and his mother, not so much to his brothers. And so they, threw him in a hole. Most of them wanted to kill him. They sold him to slave traders. Life wasn't starting out right for him as a teenager. He ended up, in several situations, and most of us know the story. But for whatever reason, it says that Joseph found favor because God actually softened the people's hearts, and because of his purpose and his principles and all of that he found favor in their sight. So we don't know exactly what it means to say they found favor, but we know that God basically was involved in why in Joseph and in Daniel that they found favor with these non-Christian people, or in that day and time non-Jewish, God-fearing people. They still found favor by their personality traits, by their commitment, by things that they saw in them that made them, impress others. And, oftentimes people will, and we're going to say this in a minute about a different thing, but oftentimes people will find us strange and may even on a good day ridicule you, but then when bad things happen, they say, hey, tell me about your faith, because it ain't working what I'm doing. My sort of sarcastic personality doesn't work when bad things happen. And, you seem to, when bad things happen to you, you don't have the same fall apart or get mad or all the things that the world thinks should happen when things don't go well. So every child of God needs to be a person of purpose. I would throw out there that no one respects a wishy-washy person. It's sometimes easy to be wishy-washy, to blend in, to try to say that, every little deal doesn't matter. Why are you so caught up on that little thing or this little thing? But, you build something block by block. And you either build a character block by block by not making sometimes this decision, sometimes that decision. You make hard decisions little by little. It builds character. A strong sense of purpose often breeds respect and admiration of others. So again, a lot of times people respect people like Daniel and people like Joseph and people like those of you who stand your ground. They respect you. They make fun of you at times for what you're doing, but they really deeply respect you, and that makes them uncomfortable. So, sometimes the ridicule is purely coming from an idea that they wish they were like you and they wish they could stand up to things, and they admire you even though they may not want to admit that they admire you. So what makes the purpose of a Christian? Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 6:33. What does it say in Matthew 6:33? Seek ye first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Or I think in the King James or something it says all these things will be added, or in our song, all these things will be added to you. So seek the will of God and fulfill it in our lives, no matter the circumstances. And finally, the fourth point here, and the last point for purpose, is that as Jesus promised, this will guarantee you God's favor towards us, and in turn likely gain us favor in the eyes of those around us. So, not in every case, if you stand your ground in a respectful way, will you ultimately, all things turn out good here on earth. This is not a prosperity message that, all good things are going to happen to you as long as you do what you're supposed to do. That doesn't always happen that way. But in general, more times than you'd like to admit, if you are respectful but firm in your purpose, then God's going to pave the way for things to be easier than if you veer off and take the temporary spoils of doing the wrong thing now. But in the long term, it leads to destruction. It leads to disasters in our life. So the first point of daring to be a Daniel is, are you a person of purpose like Daniel was? Now the second, there we go. The second thing, and I'm going to follow Neil's, trying to put everything in the same letter. So all four of his traits are going to be a P. So first was his purpose, and second's going to be his principle. And at first glance that may seem similar, your purpose and being principled. But one of them is more about where you're going, and the other one is more how you get there. So, it's nice to say I'm going to be a person of purpose and I know where I would like to go, but if you don't do anything to get there, you're unlikely to get there. You're more likely to end up somewhere else as things happen. But if you have a purpose and then you have a plan and you follow your principles, then you're likely to get where you're going and where you want to be. So again, we kind of rehash in the first point here. As a young man, by refusing to eat the king's rations, the meat, or drink his wine, he was holding to his principles. In other words, Daniel said, sorry, but it may seem like a little thing. It may seem like something I shouldn't take a stand on, but he did. And we know that this stand probably helped him prepare for some of the other stands he took, because at least this one probably would have just got him thrown back into the places where they kept the Israelites that weren't treated very well, instead of being in the king's situation where you're being educated. I think Monty called it going to university. It's like being accepted to university instead of having to do, in Florida, I think about jobs and, if you do this, God bless you. But I think about, roofing jobs in Florida in the summertime. I had a couple of friends that had boys about the same age as my boy, and they made them work as a landscaper in the summertime when they were off from high school, digging, ditches and putting pipe in and all that kind of stuff. And, every day they'd come in and say, I'm going to college and I'm going to study now, because they didn't want to do that for a living. And likewise, Daniel, may have had a little bit of that idea that, if I do what they tell me to do here, I won't have to go back to doing what these other people that they brought out that are not being given all these privileges and all that sort of thing. As an old man, and we haven't gotten to this, I think probably Craig, a shout out to Craig's going to be teaching next week, and I think we're going to learn the story in Daniel 5 about Belshazzar. But Belshazzar wanted to give Daniel a gift, and if we go to that, he was brought to the king, and the king said, if you can tell me the story here, I'll give you all sorts of things. You can be made, the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel said in 17, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. So basically, most of us would say, I want something for what I'm about to do. Now, when you do that back then to a king, it may not work very well. So, at least here, the king's offering it to him. All he has to say is thank you. But he says, I don't want your stuff because it's going to make it look like that I'm the one that did this. But instead, who was doing it? God. He gave God the credit every time. If you go through and look at all the things that happened to him, every time he never once said, let me tell you what this dream means. Let me tell you what's going on. No, never once. Every single time he was humble to a fault. And he said, it's not me. And it's so much not me that, you guys got all this stuff and I don't, and you want to give me some of it. I don't even want it. That's got to be difficult. Looking at it through our modern eyes, it's got to be difficult to not take something even, I could give God the credit and still take the stuff. It's pretty principled to say, I'd be taking something when God did it. So it's not really something I earned in the first place. God put me in this position. And then under the threat of persecution under Darius, the third thing that we also haven't talked about yet, but we all know the story of him hanging out for a night with a bunch of lions and petting them on the head and all of that kind of stuff. And, for those who probably nobody here, but for those who probably want to believe that, they must have been pet lions and, he was the lion trainer ahead of time, they took him out and threw the guys who had turned him in, and they put them in there, and I don't know, maybe he smelled good and they didn't or something, but for whatever reason, they immediately ate them. They immediately killed them. So they weren't like pet lions. They were real lions, and yet he hung out with them, and not a hair on his head was hurt. And so, the influence that God had on these non-God-fearing rulers, whether it was Nebuchadnezzar, whether it was Belshazzar, or whether it was Darius the Mede, every time, he gave God the glory, and this leader said, oh my goodness, we got to make this guy way up here in the kingdom. We got to make this guy one of the top guys, not because he was so smart. And he made the point to the point where these rulers said, the God of Daniel. The God of Daniel. And so, when you are successful in the world, instead of saying, look what I did, or saying to others, well, if you'll do what I do, because I know what I'm doing, when people ask you why you're successful or why things seem to be easier for you or why you're not fearful in a time of fear, you don't tell them all the things you did to get there. You tell them it's God. You need my God, because that's why I'm where I am, not because of anything I did. So I mentioned earlier that people admire people of principle, but sometimes outwardly they may ridicule them, but inwardly they wish they had the same intestinal fortitude. You know, have you ever been in a situation where you didn't say anything and you didn't say anything, and all of a sudden finally somebody says something and everybody goes, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I say that? Because I was thinking it, but I was scared to say it. So, you know, sometimes everybody cheers the guy that finally says the right thing. And then other times, you know, people ridicule them because they don't want to admit that they had the intestinal fortitude that they didn't have. And when they need somebody that can be trusted and depended upon to carry through a task, who do you think they'll turn to? You know, you may think somebody's funny and he's the class clown, or the person at work that's the clown, and you always want to hear what he has to say or she has to say. But when you need something done or something that's trustworthy, you don't go to that person. You don't go to the guy that's funny, necessarily. Eric, you got the microphone? Paul wants to add something.
Oftentimes, people will become jealous when things seem to be going your way because you're doing God's will and living upright. They look at you as different from them, and because things start going your way, then they become snide and bitter, and they don't always look up to you on account of it. Now, later on they might, but while it's happening, their position of power is dwindling while you are prospering, and they don't like it.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And, you know, I tell a story that was a God thing, but it happened to be something that I was involved in. You know, most of you know what my profession was, and you know, a lot of my colleagues in the medical profession are not known for their humbleness. They're not known for their attitude of being nice to everybody around them when things don't go well. You know, they're known oftentimes for lashing out, and particularly in surgery. A couple ladies over here that worked in surgery could attest to the fact that when things didn't go well, you know, one of my mentors in general surgery back in the day, about 35 years ago, when things didn't go well, he'd pick up a tray full of instruments and throw it at the wall as he was screaming and ranting and raving. Now, that's not allowed anymore, but that was what surgeons were known for back in the day. You know, they were like powder kegs. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So I had a headlight on, which cost, you know, probably $1,000, and I had it hooked up to a light source that had a light bulb that was $800, and the thing cost about $10,000 that I had on my head, and I asked them to move from one side of the patient to the other. And so I got up to move, and they didn't unplug it like I asked them to, and it went bouncing across the floor. And you know, I just went about my business. And you know, somebody came to me afterwards, one of the nurses, and said, why didn't you scream at that person? How could you be so calm and cool when that just happened? And, you know, I said at the time, because that person that's on the table is more important, and if I get my emotions all stirred up, you know, that person's going to be in trouble. But what I should have said was, I'm a God-fearing person, and, you know, I don't act like the rest of the guys when that happens, or the rest of the surgeons when that happens, because that's not the way good people act. You know, things happen, and there's time to deal with that, but that's not what good people do. That was an opportunity I missed. That was an opportunity I had to give it to God. Instead, I said, I thought it was a good thing not to, you know, put the person at risk, and so I controlled my emotions. Now, you know, it's good to teach people to control their emotions, but it should have been about God and not about me, and the way we went about doing that. So, what's that? Yeah, exactly. And, you know, that's something that hopefully over time, as they get to know you better and better, they realize that, you know, hopefully you have a purpose, you're principled, and, you know, that's just the way you act that is different, and why do you act like that? But then you need to take the advantage when it happens to give the glory where the glory belongs. Well, God admires individuals who stand by their principles and by their word. Eric, you want to, since you got the microphone, you want to read Psalm 15, 1 through 5 for us?
Yeah, it's up here.
Yeah, it's up there. Oh, I didn't put it up there. I put it up here. That aren't connected.
Here we go. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent, who may live on your holy mountain, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken.
So none of us really qualify, right? I mean, that's pretty amazing stuff right there. Blameless, righteous, no slander, no wrong to neighbors, no slur, on and on and on and on. It's sometimes scary if you just read the Old Testament, right? And that's why we love the New Testament so much, because, we relate to things Paul wrote to us about, constantly fighting over our human-led tendencies versus, the Old Testament quite often was telling you, you need to be better all the time. You need to be better. You need to be better. And, I would suggest that, though there's a New Testament and an Old Testament, same God. And I would suggest that this should be something we strive towards. Just because a famous athlete doesn't succeed 100% of the time doesn't mean their goal is not to succeed as often as possible. And likewise for us, instead of resting on, if I sin more, then mercy and grace will thrive. Well, even Paul said, no way. You should not be sinning more, so his grace means more. It means we should be different than our tendencies, different than our old person. There should be a dramatic difference between us before we go in the water and after we go in the water. Yes, we're not going to be perfect. We're not going to never sin again. But we should be significantly purposed and principled to be different and not to be falling back all the time and just relying on the fact that, hey, that's the way I am. I had a friend that was a preacher that talked about my begetting sin. And I thought, what in the world is that? And he goes, well, the one I can't overcome, so God's just going to forgive me for it no matter what. Well, I would propose that there's not too many sins that God's going to just continue to forgive you for no matter what if you just say, I'm not even going to try. You better be trying. Not that you'll be perfect, but we better be trying. So our society is in great need of a man of principle, of people with principle. So daring to be Daniel involves having a purpose and having principles, no matter the price. The next one is purity. That's something that's really lost its meaning in our culture. There was a time when there was a pretty strong evidence of what purity meant in our country, but can anybody give me a definition of what purity means without the Bible this day and time? I didn't think so. I don't think, what we used to know as purity this day and time, you can turn on the TV, and even with your kids sitting there thinking you're going to watch something that's going to be pure, you're pretty much going to, you can't turn on the TV without seeing it. And what even makes it more interesting, we were having this discussion the other day, used to you could tell by the way they rated P, PG, R, and all of that, you knew kind of what you were going to get. But we've redefined purity to the point where a G movie may emphasize things that God hates. And an R movie may be much milder when it comes to purity, depending on what we're talking about. Because, things like violence are considered terrible. And I'm not saying violence isn't terrible. But, violence may get you an R rating. But, premarital sex and that kind of stuff may get you a PG rating, and I won't even go to the rest of that. But behind you, Eric, Bill has the guy with the American flag.
Well, one of the things that we grew up in is that we always knew a white hat from a black hat. In the old westerns that I watch all the time, I see those famous characters in there. As soon as I see that character, I know he's a bad guy. He's got a black hat on. And that's what we grew up in. We could pinpoint. Everything now is gray.
Absolutely, everything's gray. At this point in time, I had an elder friend back in Naples that used to say the only thing you can do wrong today is to say somebody else is wrong. That's the only wrong. There is no other wrong but to tell somebody else they're wrong. Well, you know what? The Bible's full of people telling somebody they're wrong. I mean, Jesus would have been wrong all the time because Jesus was consistently telling people they were wrong. And so was Paul, and so was Stephen. And, of course, they didn't like it any more those days than we do because, they all ended up being murdered for something that they didn't do. They all ended up being killed for just stating the truth. But getting back to Daniel, he was faultless when it came to management of business affairs. I mean, they could not find anything that he did that you could find fault in. This would explain one of the reasons why the leaders, obviously leaders needed to surround themselves with people they could trust. Back in those days, what is it, E tu Brute? Julius Caesar ruled most of the world, and yet the guy right next to him eventually killed him. If you can't surround yourself with people that you can trust, then all is lost. And likewise, they found this Jewish kid who was apparently so trustworthy. Not only could he, interpret dreams, but he was so trustworthy in his business affairs that they just kept giving him promotions and promotions. This would help explain his rise, and of course, his purity in business affairs related to his overall purpose to please God. So he didn't do it to rise to these heights. He did it because it was the right thing to do. But they saw it as something that, this guy has got a higher purpose. This guy is principled. This guy is pure, and therefore I'm going to give this guy the job. But not because, in politics today, the higher you go, the more likely you are to be unprincipled, the more likely you are to politicians usually have a purpose. But then when you get past purpose, these ideas of principles and purity start getting worse and worse as they try to rise up the ranks. Somebody one time was a friend of mine back where I came from here that said, when are you going to run for office? Because you seem to be really interested in the political process. And I said, you don't know me at all. I said, you absolutely, positively don't know me at all. I said, after I went to 3 different places and told them the same thing, I wouldn't get half the votes. You've got to, as a politician, figure out where you're going and change what you say based on where you're going. You got to tell these people this thing, and then you got to go tell these people this thing, and you got to go tell these people that thing, and hope that you're on the side politically where the press won't tell them that you told them 3 different things instead of making a big deal out of the fact that you told them 3 different things. Because as long as you got the press on your side, you can do that. But if you don't have the press on your side, you're ultimately not going to win. So certainly that's not something I ever had any interest in, and fortunately haven't needed or wanted to do. So the Christian also is to maintain purity of conduct when you're young. In 1 Timothy 4:12 and Titus 2:6-8, it tells Timothy, Paul writing to Timothy, telling him to be pure in your conduct, and then whether slave or free. So it goes on in Titus to even talk about the idea as a slave, that the way to get your master to treat you right, to trust you, was to do the right thing. Be someone pure, be someone principled, have a purpose. And we saw that with, Joseph and with Daniel. The way they rose up from slaves to being leaders of an entire country wasn't by fighting it and adversarial about class warfare and all the things that we're supposed to get in our tribe and throw stones at the other people. That's not the way of God. And it's not the way that you even succeed most of the time in this world. You create problems. You don't create things that lead to better things by dividing into our tribes. So the final thing, and boy, we're getting close. I didn't think it was going to, I thought I'd have a lot more discussion and still get through this, but without much discussion, we're going to maybe finally get through this. So we need to be purposeful, principled, and pure. But probably the last thing that tied it all together was his idea of he was a man of prayer. The first thing, or nearly the first thing that happened every time, whether it was when he needed to eat the right food, whether it was when he was going to be thrown in a den of lions, no matter what it was, one of the first things he did was pray and go ask his friends to pray. He was a strong man of prayer. He knelt in prayer to demonstrate his humility. He prayed 3 times a day. I hear too often this day and time, ritualistic things like going to church. That's not so important. You need to be a good Christian. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's true. I think that you need to be a good Christian too. I think that may come first. But being a good Christian means showing up with your brothers and sisters, because you don't come here to see what you're going to be entertained and what you're going to hear and get a good lesson from Neil or Shaq or somebody, from Stacy. You show up because others need you. And if things are going good in your life and you don't need to come here because everything's going good in your life, you're supposed to be coming here to help people, to find out what's going on in other people's lives, to help them. So ritualistically getting into a ritual of praying regularly is something you should do. Ritual or not, it's what we should be doing. He gave thanks in the midst of persecution, a demonstration of his gratitude and the fact that he had not lost sight of God's blessings. His prayers were accustomed since his early days. So we better, hope that we train our children to have a consistent prayer life, model to our children consistent prayer. When something happens, first thing they should see us doing is going to pray, not going off, not showing that because we're in charge. That's something we need to all learn and do. So is it not likely that his custom to pray diligently helped him remain a man of purpose, principle, and purity despite his rise to power and preeminence? Because we all know that eventually if you get too much power and preeminence, it corrupts. What's the word? Power corrupts completely. Even Solomon, wisest guy that ever lived, he eventually lost it because of all of his success. And that's something we have to always be careful about. I guess we're out of time, but I'm going to just really quickly read through the last little bit here. We are to pray often as Christians. Our efforts to live purposeful, principled lives and pure lives could an undisciplined prayer life be our downfall? Particularly when things are going too well. I think most of us remember to pray more often when things are going poorly than when things are going well. So there is a false assumption that to get ahead in this world, we need to conform to the sinful practices of the world. But even today, there are many Christians who demonstrate that when one dares to be a Daniel, they can succeed in the affairs of men without selling their souls to the world. And does anybody have anything else before I turn it over and say that we're done for the break here? Any last-minute comments? If not, let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful that we're able to come together this morning, that we're so thankful that we were able to dodge what could have been a horrible thing here, and that we have the ability to come together and with air conditioning and electricity and all the things that we're used to worship you, to praise you. But we need to be cognizant of those just south of us that don't have that, and that we should be looking not only to pray for them first, but to also find ways that we can help them to bring things back to the way they should be. And we've been given an opportunity not far away, but just close by to help those and help us to figure out how to do that as we go through the next few weeks. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.